Why did a remote peninsula in East Asia become the battleground for one of the most dangerous confrontations of the 20th century? Why did millions of soldiers, American, Korean, Chinese, and many others, fight, bleed, and die in a war that was never officially declared and never truly resolved? And why does the border between North and South Korea remain one of the most fortified places on Earth even today? These questions lie at the heart of a conflict often called America's Forgotten War, a name that hardly reflects the enormous sacrifice made by those who served. Yet behind that label is a dramatic story of ambition, fear, miscalculation, and endurance. A story that reshaped the Cold War and still shapes global politics today. To understand how the Korean War began, we must step back to the turbulent final days of World War II. For 35 years, Korea had lived under harsh Japanese colonial rule. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the world powers needed a quick, practical solution to divide responsibility for Japan's withdrawal from the peninsula. Two young American colonels drew a line across a National Geographic map, the 38th parallel. Soviet troops would accept the Japanese surrender north of that line. American troops would do the same to the south. It was intended as a temporary military convenience, nothing more. But the Cold War was already emerging from the ashes of World War II, and that temporary line quickly hardened into a political frontier. In the north, the Soviet Union supported Kim Il-sung, a charismatic guerrilla leader who dreamed of unifying Korea under communist rule. In the south, the United States backed Syngman Rhee, an anti-communist nationalist who insisted his government was the only legitimate one on the peninsula. By 1948, two separate Koreas had fully emerged. By 1949, both Soviet and American occupation forces had largely withdrawn, leaving two rival armies facing each other across the 38th parallel. Throughout that year and into early 1950, small border clashes turned into escalating raids. Each side accused the other of aggression. Each claimed they would someday unify Korea. The peninsula was a powder keg, tense, divided, and waiting for a spark. That spark came at dawn on June 25, 1950. With Soviet approval and convinced that the United States would not intervene, Kim Il-sung ordered a massive invasion into the south. Nearly 90,000 North Korean soldiers surged across the border, supported by more than 200 Soviet-built T-34 tanks. South Korean forces, poorly equipped and without tanks of their own, were overwhelmed almost immediately. Seoul fell in just 3 days. The suddenness and intensity of the attack stunned both South Koreans and Americans. President Harry Truman, fearing another expansion of communism like what had happened in Eastern Europe, quickly sought United Nations support.
Let's go!
Within days, the United States sent troops from Japan to stop the North Korean advance. 16 allied nations would soon join what became known as the United Nations Command. But in those early weeks, the situation looked bleak. North Korean forces pushed the Americans and South Koreans into a shrinking corner around the port city of Pusan. This narrow zone became known as the Pusan Perimeter, a desperate defensive line where UN forces struggled to hold their ground through some of the hottest summer weeks on record. Supplies ran low, casualties mounted, but American and South Korean troops held the line long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The defense of the Pusan Perimeter bought time that General Douglas MacArthur would use for one of the most daring operations in military history. In September 1950, MacArthur launched an amphibious assault at the port of Incheon, far behind North Korean lines. It was an incredibly risky plan. Shallow tides, narrow channels, and fortified seawalls made a landing seem impossible. But the gamble worked. The surprise attack broke the North Korean supply lines and forced them into a chaotic retreat. Seoul was recaptured. In a matter of weeks, the momentum of the war flipped completely. American and South Korean forces pushed north, crossing the 38th parallel with the intention of reunifying Korea under a non-communist government. The war that had begun with a North Korean invasion was now turning into a campaign to eliminate communism from the entire peninsula. But as UN forces pushed toward the Yalu River, the border between Korea and China, Beijing grew alarmed. China feared American troops at its doorstep. Despite warnings, MacArthur dismissed the possibility that China would intervene, believing that the war would end swiftly. He was wrong. In late October 1950, waves of Chinese troops, known as the People's Volunteer Army, crossed into Korea under cover of night. Fighting in small mobile units, often without radios, they used horns, whistles, and bugles to coordinate their movements. Their sudden appearance stunned American forces, and one of the most brutal phases of the war began. The winter of 1950 was one of the coldest on record. In temperatures that plunged to 30 degrees below zero, American Marines fought a harrowing retreat from the Chosin Reservoir. Vehicles froze, weapons jammed. Frostbite claimed as many victims as bullets. It was one of the most grueling marches in American military history, yet the Marines held together and broke out to the coast, bringing out their wounded and their dead. By early 1951, Seoul had changed hands again, making it one of the only cities in modern history to be captured and recaptured 4 times in a single year. Through early 1951, the war seesawed across central Korea. UN forces eventually stabilized the front and pushed the Chinese and North Koreans back above the 38th parallel. But by mid-1951, the conflict had settled into a grinding stalemate. Both sides dug trenches, fortified hills, and fought bitter battles for small patches of ground that cost thousands of lives. It resembled World War I more than World War II. Endless artillery barrages, freezing winters, muddy foxholes, and little strategic movement. Negotiations began in July 1951, but the talks dragged on for 2 years as both sides argued over prisoners of war and the exact placement of the new boundary line. While diplomats debated, soldiers continued to fight and die. Hill battles like Heartbreak Ridge, Pork Chop Hill, and the Punch Bowl became symbols of the war's agony, tactical victories with devastating human costs. Meanwhile, American air power unleashed massive bombing campaigns across the north. Virtually every major North Korean city was heavily damaged or destroyed. Factories, railroads, and supply centers were reduced to rubble. It was one of the most intense bombing campaigns in history, its full impact still visible in North Korea's landscape today. As the war dragged on, President Truman relieved General MacArthur after a series of public disagreements over war strategy. MacArthur wanted to expand the war into China, even hinting at the use of nuclear weapons. Truman, fearing a wider conflict that could trigger World War III, insisted on a limited war. The decision was controversial at the time, but is widely seen today as a crucial step in preventing the conflict from spiraling into a global catastrophe. By 1953, both sides were exhausted. China had suffered staggering casualties. North Korea was devastated. the United States faced mounting public frustration over a war with no clear victory in sight. And South Korea, despite heavy losses, still yearned for reunification that now seemed increasingly distant. When Dwight D. Eisenhower became president in January 1953, he signaled that the United States was willing to take tougher measures, including the potential use of nuclear weapons if negotiations did not progress. Whether because of this pressure or their own internal fatigue, China and North Korea finally showed willingness to compromise. On July 27, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed at Panmunjom. It ended the fighting but did not bring peace. The border between North and South Korea was restored near the 38th parallel, with a new buffer zone called the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, still one of the most fortified regions in the world. No formal peace treaty has ever been signed. Technically, the Korean War never ended. The human cost of the conflict was staggering. An estimated 3 million Koreans, many of them civilians, were killed or wounded. China suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties. The United States lost more than 36,000 service members, with over 100,000 wounded. More than 1 million families on the peninsula were torn apart, many never to be reunited. Entire cities were reduced to ashes. The scars, emotional, physical, and political, remain visible today. Yet the war also shaped the modern world in profound ways. It marked the first major armed conflict of the Cold War and defined the concept of a limited war, where superpowers fought indirectly to avoid nuclear escalation. It cemented America's alliances in Asia, strengthened the United Nations' role in collective security, and set the stage for decades of tension between the United States, China, and the Soviet Union. It also reinforced the division of Korea, a division that continues to influence global politics, military strategy, and regional stability. And so the Korean War, though often overlooked, stands as a pivotal moment in modern history. It is a reminder of how fragile peace can be, and how easily local conflicts can grow into international crises. It is a testament to the courage and resilience of those who served, men and women who endured cold, fear, hardship, and unimaginable sacrifice. Their story deserves to be remembered, not forgotten. And even today, as tensions rise and fall on the Korean Peninsula, the lessons of the Korean War remain as relevant as ever.